My name is Amber Hale, and I am 24 years old. I want you to take a second, right now, wherever you are listening to this, and just listen to the sound of your own breath, in and out. It's a quiet thing, isn't it? It's something we take for granted every single second of our lives. We don't think about the air filling our lungs. Until suddenly, without warning, the room begins to tilt, and that simple, beautiful act of breathing becomes an absolute battlefield. If you've ever had to quietly choke down your own panic just to keep from making a scene, for the sake of other people's comfort, I want you to drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from, because I truly need to know how many of us have lived through this exact same silent nightmare. Let me set the scene for you. It was a humid Saturday evening, the kind of night where the air feels thick enough to chew. We were gathered at my parents' house for my mother Sarah's 50th birthday party. The house was decorated to the absolute nines. There were massive, shimmering gold balloons tied to the backs of the mahogany dining chairs. The ceiling was a maze of metallic gold streamers that twisted and caught the light every time someone opened the front door. And wrapped around my mother's shoulder was a thick, glittery satin sash my father had bought her. It read, in bold, sweeping script, "Queen for a day." And she truly felt like one. The house was packed with over 30 guests, extended cousins, neighbors from down the street, and colleagues from my father's real estate firm. The air was heavy with the rich, sickly sweet scent of vanilla frosting and expensive floral perfume. Everywhere I looked, people were laughing, clinking their heavy crystal glasses, and swapping the kind of shallow, performative gossip that my family absolutely thrived on. The noise was deafening. It was a chaotic symphony of booming laughter, ice shaking against glass, and the constant, high-pitched chatter of people trying to outdo one another. And right there, standing directly beside a porcelain farmhouse sink that was practically overflowing with dirty, lipstick-stained wine glasses and cake plates, was me. I was doing what I always did at these family gatherings. I was acting as the invisible gears that kept their perfect machine running. I was washing, drying, fetching extra ice, running to the basement for more napkins, and clearing the tables before the clutter could ruin my mother's carefully curated aesthetic. I was a daughter, yes, but in that house, I was primarily treated like a piece of high-functioning utility furniture. Convenient to have around when there was labor to be done, but completely invisible the moment the spotlight turned back on. That was when it happened. It didn't start with a dramatic gasp or a sudden collapse. It started quietly, right behind my ribs. At first, it felt like a tiny, cold finger pressing against the center of my chest. I thought maybe I had just swallowed a sip of water too fast, or maybe the heat from the running dishwater was getting to me. But within less than 30 seconds, that tiny pressure shifted. It tightened. It felt as though a massive, heavy iron fist had reached inside my ribcage, wrapped itself around my lungs, and began squeezing with a slow, deliberate force. I stopped mid-motion, a wet crystal wine glass still dripping in my right hand. I tried to take a deep, stabilizing breath, the kind they teach you to take when you feel a wave of anxiety coming on, but my chest simply wouldn't expand. My lungs grabbed desperately for the air in the room, but they found absolutely nothing. It was like trying to breathe through a tightly pinched straw. A wave of absolute terror washed over me, hot and dizzying. The bright kitchen lights suddenly seemed to flare, burning into my eyes, and the loud, buzzing voices of the guests behind me began to recede into a distant, muffled echo, like I was underwater. My heart began to hammer against my ribs so violently. I was certain the people standing near the island could hear it. The room began to tilt on its axis. My first instinct, the tragic, conditioned instinct that my family had spent 24 years drilling into my brain, was to hide it. Don't make a scene, Amber. Don't ruin your mother's special night. I pressed my left palm flat against the granite counter, gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white, forcing a rigid, fragile smile onto my face. I tried to swallow the suffocating panic that was crawling up my throat like black smoke, desperately praying that if I just stood still enough, the room would stop spinning and the air would find its way back into my body. But the air never came. My knees began to feel like water. The heavy, wet crystal glass I was holding slipped from my numb fingers, dropping into the deep porcelain sink with a sharp, echoing clank that should have drawn every eye in the room. But it didn't. The laughter behind me just kept rolling, thick and continuous. I stood there, swaying softly against the counter, my throat working like a fish out of water. I could feel the cold sweat breaking out across my forehead, dripping down the side of my face, and tracing the rigid line of my jaw. My mother, Sarah, was standing less than 3 feet away from me. She was leaning over the kitchen island, meticulously slicing another massive wedge of the 3-tiered vanilla cake. The gold queen for a day sash caught the light with every move of her arm. She was completely wrapped up in her own glory, calling out to a neighbor about the organic ingredients she had insisted on for the frosting. I managed to lean slightly toward her, my vision blurring into a haze of bright, pixelated dots. I opened my mouth, but the air wouldn't cooperate. I had to summon every ounce of strength left in my collapsing body just to push out a sound. It came out thin, raspy, and entirely broken. A desperate, pathetic shred of a voice. "I can't breathe," I whispered. "Mom, please, I can't breathe." She didn't even turn her head. She didn't look at the way my chest was heaving up and down without drawing air, or notice that my fingers were curling into tight, claw-like shapes against the granite. Her hand remained steady on the cake knife. Without missing a beat, her voice cut through the air, sharp, annoyed, and entirely dismissive. "Enough drama, Amber. Honestly, quit faking it. You always find a way to make yourself the center of attention, especially when I have guests over. Get your hands back in that sink, clean up these dessert plates, and get in the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. People are waiting." Before I could even absorb the coldness of those words, my father, David, stepped into the kitchen entryway to top off his glass of wine. He looked over at me, catching the way I was slumping against the counter. Instead of concern, his face shifted into that familiar, ugly little sneer he always used whenever he wanted me to feel small. The look that reminded me I was nothing more than an inconvenience to his household peace. "Stop being so incredibly lazy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly snap. "Your mother has worked hard all day to put this together. The least you can do is help her keep the place looking decent, instead of leaning around like a victim. Clean the counters." The room tilted violently then, the bright gold balloons blurring into long streaks of metallic light. My grip on the counter failed completely. I reached out blindly to steady myself, my hand sweeping across the island and knocking a heavy glass of red wine right over the edge. It shattered against the hardwood floor, a dark crimson puddle spreading rapidly outward, staining the white baseboards. That was the moment the fragile illusion cracked, but not because of my parents. My brother Jake's friend, Eric, had just walked into the kitchen to grab a soda from the refrigerator. Unlike my family, Eric wasn't looking through me. He wasn't tracking how much labor I was providing, or how well I was maintaining the family's public image. The moment he saw my face, he stopped dead in his tracks. He wasn't laughing anymore. He dropped his drink, stepped right over the puddle of spilled wine, and closed the distance between us in a single second. He grabbed my trembling right wrist, his thumb pressing firmly against my radial artery to check my pulse. I looked into his eyes, and right before my vision began to go dark around the edges, I saw his face drain of color so quickly. It looked like he had seen a ghost. His eyes went wide with genuine medical alarm. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check with my mother for permission to care. He turned toward the crowded dining room and yelled with a booming, authoritative voice that completely cut through the music and the chatter. "Call 911 right now. She's asphyxiating." For one absolute terrifying second, the entire party went dead silent. The clinking of glasses stopped mid-air. The laughter evaporated instantly. 30 faces turned toward the kitchen, frozen in shock, staring at Eric, holding my limp body up against the counter. Then, total panic exploded across the living room. People started shouting, chairs scraped loudly against the floor, and someone dropped a plate. But as the chaos erupted around me, the worst part wasn't the physical agony of my lungs starving for oxygen. The worst part, the part that burned directly into my soul, was looking across the kitchen island and realizing that my mother had heard every single gasp, had heard my broken plea for help, and had still looked me in the eyes and assumed I was just performing for attention. If you have ever had to quietly sit over a cup of coffee and analyze exactly why the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally treated you like a burden, you know that the realization doesn't come all at once. It's a slow, quiet, agonizing burn. Take a look around your own life right now. Are you the person who always yields? Are you the one who cleans up the broken glass while everyone else eats the cake? If you are, type the word visible in the comments below. Because for 24 years, I was completely invisible. As I lay there on the kitchen floor, the silence that followed Eric's shout lasted only a single breath, but in that one frozen pocket of time, my mind recorded every single detail with terrifying clarity. I remember every face inside that room, etched with a bizarre mixture of shock and irritation. My mother, Sarah, stood perfectly still near the end of the mahogany dining table. The heavy silver cake knife was still gripped tightly in her hand, coated in thick white vanilla frosting. She was still wearing that ridiculous gold birthday sash my father had bought her, the one that screamed queen for a day in glittery letters. She wasn't looking at me with terror. She was looking at me with absolute resentment, as if my failing lungs were a personal insult to her catering budget. Beside her stood my father, David. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his posture rigid and unyielding. The exact same church-polite posture he used whenever he wanted to signal to the world that he was a respectable man, dealing with an unrespectable situation. To him, my medical emergency wasn't a crisis of life and death. It was a profound social inconvenience. It was a stain on the perfect evening he had financed. And then there was my brother, Jake. Just 2 seconds earlier, he had been laughing loudly with a group of older cousins near the patio doors, loudly joking that I always found a complex way to make every family milestone entirely about myself. Now, his laughter was frozen onto his face in a grotesque, awkward smile. He kept looking back and forth between me and Eric, desperately waiting for someone to laugh, waiting for the punchline, waiting for someone to tell him that this was all just a poorly timed joke. But Eric did not smile. He didn't care about the family hierarchy. And he certainly didn't care about the unspoken rule in our house that required everyone to pretend everything was always fine. He lowered me onto a kitchen chair with a firm, steady hand, keeping his fingers pressed heavily against my racing pulse. His voice was sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of the usual deference my parents demanded from younger people. "Amber, look directly at me," Eric commanded, his eyes locking onto mine. "Don't try to talk. Don't look at them. Just focus entirely on the pressure of my hand. Breathe with me. Slow down." I tried. God, I tried so hard, but the air was coming into my chest in short, broken, useless pieces that didn't feel like air at all. My fingertips had started to tingle with a terrifying, numb sensation that was slowly creeping up my forearms. Around the perimeter of the kitchen, the party guests began to shift, uncomfortably. They muttered to one another in hushed, hurried tones, completely unsure whether they should step forward to offer help, or continue pretending they hadn't just witnessed my parents completely humiliate and dismiss me while I was suffocating. Someone in the back whispered, "Is she actually sick? Or is she just having an episode?" Another voice immediately answered, "I thought she was just upset about something. You know how she gets." Hearing those whispers hurt far more than the agonizing pressure building up inside my chest. It was the ultimate proof of the quiet, systematic framing my family had engaged in for over a decade. They had meticulously trained everyone in our social circle to see me not as a daughter, not as a human being with real vulnerabilities, but as a perpetual problem, a dramatic variable that needed to be managed and minimized, so the rest of them could shine. When I was 8 years old, I fell off my bicycle in the driveway, scraping my palms completely open until blood shined between the tiny embedded stones. I ran inside the house crying, desperately expecting comfort and open arms. My mother looked up from a phone call, irritated, and simply mouthed, "Not now." My father glanced down at my bleeding hands and muttered, "You're fine, Amber. Don't make a production out of it." That was the foundational lesson of my childhood. My pain was only acceptable if it remained entirely silent and didn't disturb anyone else's comfort. My mother, Sarah, finally moved from her spot by the dining table, but she didn't take a single step toward the chair where I was fighting for my life. Instead, her eyes locked instantly onto the dark puddle of red wine spreading across her freshly polished hardwood floor. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh, pressing her manicured hand flat against her chest as if the ruined flooring was the true tragedy of the evening. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said, her voice dripping with a bizarre mixture of anger and self-pity. "Amber, why on earth would you choose to do this right now? In front of everyone?" Eric's head snapped up so fast his neck practically popped. His eyes were blazing with a clinical, protective fury that I had never once seen directed at my parents. "Mrs. Hale, look at her face," Eric said, his voice dropping into a dangerous icy register. "Your daughter is in severe respiratory distress. This isn't a behavioral issue. It's a medical crisis." My mother's mouth instantly tightened into a thin, rigid line. "She gets anxious, Eric. You don't know her history like we do. She always does this whenever she feels overwhelmed or wants to avoid helping out. She just needs to calm down." Eric's jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched violently along his cheekbone. For the first time in my entire 24 years of existence, someone looked at my mother like she was the actual emergency in the room. "Anxiety can quickly escalate into a full-blown medical crisis," Eric said, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers of the party guests like a scalpel. "And by standing there berating her, you are actively making it worse." That sentence landed in the middle of the kitchen like a physical slap. My father, David, immediately stepped forward to defend his wife's honor, his voice low, deep, and laced with his signature corporate authority. "Young man," my father growled, stepping into Eric's personal space, "I suggest you watch your tone. Do not speak to my wife like that in our house." Eric didn't flinch. He didn't back down a single inch. He looked my father dead in the eye and said, "Then I suggest you start acting like this is your daughter in your house." Me? Jake muttered something defensive under his breath, shaking his head, but Eric turned his sharp gaze onto him next. "Jake, you call 911 right this second, or I will do it myself on speakerphone." And when the paramedics arrive and ask why nobody called sooner, I will tell them exactly what I witnessed here. It was fascinating, in a horrific sort of way, to watch how quickly the dynamic shifted the moment the word witness was introduced. It wasn't sudden compassion that made my brother finally pull out his phone. It wasn't a sudden wave of parental terror that made my mother stop complaining about the floor. It was the sheer, terrifying possibility of being publicly exposed. It was the realization that their narrative could no longer be contained within the quiet walls of their living room. Jake's hands were visibly shaking as he finally pressed the keypad, his face suddenly serious now that the drama had a real audience. My mother stepped back toward the dining room, smoothing down her clothing and loudly whispering to a neighbor, "I just wanted one peaceful 50th birthday. Just one night." Even through the roaring sound of rushing blood in my ears, I understood exactly what she was doing. She was already rewriting the script, transforming my physical emergency into her personal sacrifice. Minutes later, the distant rising wail of sirens began to echo down our quiet suburban street. When the red and blue emergency lights started flashing through the front windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the walls, the festive party decorations suddenly looked completely grotesque. The gold balloons tied to the chairs, the plates of half-eaten cake, the shimmering streamers. All of it felt like a sick, twisted stage set while absolute strangers carried heavy oxygen tanks and medical bags past my frozen family. A female paramedic knelt down in front of me, instantly slipping an oxygen mask over my face. The cold, dry air hit my throat, and for the first time in what felt like hours, my lungs began to accept the intake. She turned to the room, asking sharply, who was with her when the symptoms first started? How long has she been gasping like this? My mother stepped forward, her face twisting into a perfectly practiced mask of maternal panic, ready to smooth it all over. Well, she was just clearing some dishes, and I was nearby, Eric interrupted cleanly, cutting my mother off before she could spin the truth. She explicitly told her mother she couldn't breathe. Her family dismissed her claims entirely and actively delayed calling emergency services because they thought she was seeking attention. Sarah gasped aloud, her cheeks flushing bright red beneath her heavy makeup. Eric, that is completely unfair. We had no idea. The paramedic didn't even let her finish. She looked at Eric, nodded firmly, and said, "Thank you for the accurate timeline." She turned back to me, ignoring my mother entirely. As they lifted me onto a heavy rolling stretcher, I caught a glimpse of my mother's face in the kitchen mirror. There was fear there, yes, but it wasn't the kind of fear I had spent my entire life dreaming about. She wasn't terrified of losing her daughter. She was absolutely terrified of how this looked to the neighbors standing on their lawns watching the ambulance. As they wheeled me past the massive birthday cake that absolutely no one was cutting now, a single question burned through the fading panic in my mind. If my own flesh and blood could ignore the literal sound of me fighting for breath, how many times had they ignored me dying quietly in much smaller ways? Inside the ambulance, the chaotic noise of the party faded into a steady, rhythmic hum of medical equipment. A paramedic attached cardiac wires to my chest, while the cold, dry oxygen kept flowing through my mask. From near the back doors, I could hear Eric's voice quietly but firmly asking the driver if he could follow us to the hospital in his own car. I wanted to pull off the mask and thank him, but my body was completely exhausted from the sheer effort of surviving. By the time they wheeled my stretcher through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, the bright, sterile, fluorescent lights made everything feel intensely real. Nurses moved around me with practiced efficiency, checking my vitals, asking about my medical history, and running preliminary blood tests. For the first time all evening, nobody was rolling their eyes at my pain. Nobody was telling me that my inability to draw breath was an elaborate performance designed to ruin a party. Eric arrived in the waiting room minutes later. He didn't crowd my space. He stayed back near the doorway to let the medical staff work, but he didn't disappear. That presence mattered more than I can accurately describe. For 24 years, my family had made affection and care feel entirely conditional. I had to earn a scrap of their approval by being perfectly convenient, perfectly quiet, and perfectly useful. But Eric made human decency look incredibly simple. Someone was in danger, so he stayed. An hour later, the sharp click of high heels echoed sharply down the tiled hallway. The door to my curtained cubicle swung open without a single knock, and my mother walked in first. She was still wearing her gold birthday sash, though it now hung crookedly across her shoulder, wrinkling her expensive blouse. My father followed closely behind, his face locked in a hard, rigid expression, embodying his usual church-polite posture. Jake came last, awkwardly carrying a clear plastic container containing a large slice of vanilla birthday cake, as if presenting it was tangible proof that the party had successfully survived my disruption. My mother instantly rushed toward the side of my bed with her arms wide open. But her eyes weren't locked onto mine. Her gaze darted rapidly to Eric, standing by the door, and then to the attending nurse who was adjusting my IV line. It was an immediate, calculated performance of maternal devotion for the benefit of the witnesses in the room. "My poor sweet baby," she said, her voice entirely too loud for a quiet recovery ward. "You absolutely scared us half to death tonight. We came as soon as we could." I stared blankly at her from the pillow. The oxygen mask was off now, replaced by a thin nasal cannula. "I scared you?" I asked, my voice thin, raspy, but entirely cold. She reached out and lightly patted the top of my hospital blanket, carefully avoiding making direct skin-to-skin contact with my hand. "Of course you did, Amber. 1 minute you were just helping out in the kitchen, and the next thing we know, Eric is shouting at the top of his lungs like the entire house is burning down." It was incredibly dramatic. Eric immediately stood up from his chair. "Mrs. Hale, she wasn't being dramatic. She was literally suffocating. Her oxygen saturation levels were dangerously low." My father stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he fixed Eric with a sharp, warning glare. "We understand the medical reality now, young man, but this is strictly family business. You have done your part, and now you need to step outside." "No," I said, the single word cutting through the room. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't shake. I looked directly at my father. "Eric stays. He's the only reason I'm breathing right now." My mother looked deeply wounded, pressing her manicured hand to her chest as if I had physically struck her. "Amber, please? Today was my 50th birthday. I had over 30 respected guests watching you collapse onto my kitchen floor. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was for us?" There it was, the real injury. It wasn't terror over my health. It was the profound social humiliation of having their carefully managed family dynamic exposed to the neighbors. Jake set the plastic container of cake down on my bedside table with a careless shrug. "Look, Amber, you have to admit the timing was pretty insane. Right when Mom was about to blow out her candles." I looked at my brother, feeling a sudden, sharp clarity wash over my mind. "My lungs didn't check your social schedule, Jake." I remembered my college graduation day clearly. Jake had made a cruel, mocking joke about my appearance right before the ceremony, causing me to break down in tears. When I tried to explain how much it hurt, my father pulled me aside and told me I was being too sensitive and was completely ruining the celebratory family dinner. My entire life had been defined by this exact trap. Their cruelty was always framed as a joke, and my pain was always framed as a character flaw. My father stepped closer to the bed, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register. He used to demand absolute obedience. "Don't get smart with us, Amber," he whispered sharply. "You're only in this because you worked yourself up into a hysterical state. Your mother was just trying to keep a beautiful party together, and you are actively turning this into a federal case to punish us. You need to fix this behavior before we leave this hospital." The words sat heavily in the small clinical space. You need to fix this behavior. For years, that sentence would have sent me into a tailspin of compliance. I would have started crying, started apologizing for my own lack of oxygen, started shrinking myself down so my father's temper wouldn't flare. But looking at the three of them standing at the foot of my hospital bed, my mother with her crooked queen for a day sash, my father with his corporate defensive scowl, and my brother with a piece of cake he brought like a prop, something inside me snapped. Or rather, it went beautifully, entirely still. I didn't yell. I didn't get angry. I just let the silence stretch out between us until the steady rhythmic beep of the heart monitor felt like the loudest sound in the room. She told me to clean the kitchen while I was telling her. "I couldn't breathe," I said softly, turning my head to look directly at the wall. My mother recoiled as if I had thrown boiling water at her. "Amber, how can you possibly say something so malicious after everything your father and I have sacrificed to give you a good life?" "Because it's exactly what happened, Mom," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and entirely detached. "You didn't care whether my emergency was real. You only cared that it was loud enough to disturb your guests." Before my father could step in to bark another command, the privacy curtain was pulled back with a sharp metallic zip. A nurse stepped into the cubicle. Her name badge read Marisol, and she carried herself with the calm, immovable authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with families who mistook control for care. She didn't look at my parents. She walked straight over to my side, checked the fluid levels on my IV line, and then looked directly down into my eyes. "Amber," Nurse Marisol said, her voice a low, steady anchor. "Do you feel entirely safe and comfortable continuing this family visit right now?" My mother's mouth fell open in absolute disbelief. "Excuse me, I am her mother. Of course she is safe with us. This is a private family matter." Nurse Marisol didn't even turn her head to acknowledge the interruption. She kept her eyes locked onto mine, completely ignoring my mother's rising panic. "Amber, I am asking you, do you want them to stay? Or would you like me to clear the room so you can get some rest?" My hands curled tightly around the rough edge of the hospital blanket. Every single childhood instinct drilled into my brain screamed at me to protect the family peace. Protect my mother's image. Protect my father's pride. Protect Jake from having to face the consequences of his cruelty. But then I closed my eyes and I was back on the kitchen floor, kneeling beside the porcelain sink, unable to fill my lungs, hearing my own mother tell me to quit faking it and clean. I opened my eyes, looked Nurse Marisol directly in the face, and said a single clear word. "No." The word was tiny, but it hit the room like a physical explosion. My mother inhaled sharply, grasping at her necklace. My father's face darkened into a furious, crimson mask, and Jake muttered my name under his breath like a threat. Nurse Marisol immediately stepped between my bed and my family, her posture turning into a literal wall of clinical protection. "All right, then this visit is officially over. The patient is under strict medical orders to maintain a low-stress environment. You all need to gather your things and exit the ward immediately." "Amber, you are throwing your own family out of a hospital," my mother wailed, her voice instantly shifting into that high-pitched, wounded public tone she used to make everyone rush to her defense. "After everything I've done for you." "I'm not throwing you out," I whispered, looking her straight in the eyes, as Nurse Marisol began guiding them toward the curtain. I'm choosing to breathe. They had to walk out themselves. There was no dramatic security wrestling match. It was much worse for them. They had to walk down that long, brightly lit corridor past the nurse's station while Nurse Marisol held the cubicle curtain open. And Eric watched them leave. My father looked profoundly humiliated, his jaw locked tight. Jake kept his eyes glued to the floor, and my mother looked entirely betrayed, as if my boundary was a weapon I had wielded to harm her, rather than a shield to protect my own life. The moment the heavy double doors of the ward swung shut behind them, a massive tremor rolled through my body. I shook so hard the hospital blanket vibrated against my skin. But beneath the shaking, for the very first time in my entire life, wasn't guilt. It was an unfamiliar, beautiful, intoxicating wave of pure relief. That night, after the hospital floor finally quieted down, I couldn't sleep. The room was dark except for the steady green blink of the heart monitor and the thin strip of pale hallway light slicing under my door. My phone kept buzzing against the metal bedside table, a relentless, vibrating reminder of the world outside. I didn't even have to pick it up to know the exact pattern of what was waiting for me. First would come my father's white-hot anger, then my mother's suffocating guilt, followed by a hollow, half-hearted apology from Jake designed entirely to force me to apologize back. I reached over, flipped the phone screen face down onto the table, and just listened to the quiet, unhurried sound of my own breathing. In and out. Mine. For the first time in 24 years, my body didn't feel like a broken machine or an emotional enemy. It felt like a loyal witness that had finally screamed loudly enough to force me to listen. The next morning, the attending physician returned to my room, holding a thick manila folder containing my test results. He pulled up a rolling stool, looked at me with a warmth my father had never managed, and delivered the ultimate logic twist. "Amber, your vitals are completely stable, and we're going to clear you for discharge this afternoon," he said, tapping the papers. "But I want to be entirely clear with you. Stress does not mean this crisis was imaginary. Your physical symptoms were incredibly real. Your body experienced a severe respiratory response to an unsustainable level of environmental distress. Recovery means treating both the patient and the environment." Those words, treating the environment, sat in my chest heavier than any medical diagnosis. The hospital was giving clinical, unassailable language to the exact boundary my heart had been trying to build for years. My family had spent a lifetime convincing me that I was the fragile, broken link in the chain. But an objective medical professional was telling me that my surroundings were literally toxic enough to make my body revolt. When my phone buzzed again, I finally turned it over. The screen was an absolute graveyard of notifications, 37 missed calls, and 72 text messages. Most were a frantic, looping narrative from my mother, but one single message from my father stood out. It read, "You completely embarrassed your mother in front of our friends. Fix this immediately." I read it twice, and for the very first time in my life, I felt absolutely no urge to fix a single thing. I handed the phone directly to Eric. "Can you help me screenshot every single one of these messages and back them up to a secure drive?" Eric looked up, his brow furrowing. "Of course, but what are they for?" "For myself," I said, my voice firmer than it had ever been. "For the next time they try to convince me that I imagined how cruel they were." That afternoon, Nurse Marisol suggested I take a short walk down to the common area to get my blood moving before my official discharge. My legs were still incredibly heavy, but I desperately wanted to feel like a person again, not just a patient tied to wires. Eric walked right beside me, keeping his arm close enough that I knew I wouldn't hit the linoleum floor if my knees betrayed me. The common area was a wide, quiet space with massive windows overlooking the city and a few tired potted plants. I sat down in a chair near the sunlight, closing my eyes and letting the warmth hit my face. For a few minutes, there was absolute peace. Then, the heavy double doors at the end of the hallway swung open with a loud, aggressive bang. Unbelievable, a sharp, familiar voice echoed down the corridor. It was Jake. She gets herself a catered hospital vacation, and we're treated like the villains of the story. My spine instantly turned to pure ice. Eric's shoulders locked into a rigid line. Jake rounded the corner into the sunlit room, with my mother trailing closely behind him and my father bringing up the rear. They had completely ignored the nurse's explicit instructions, likely using my father's church polite authority to manipulate the receptionist at the front desks into believing they were just a grieving family here to apologize. My mother's eyes were slightly pink, but her bright red lipstick was entirely flawless. She had prepared for an audience. "Amber," she said, her voice dropping into a soft, melodic purr as she noticed a few other patients sitting across the room. "We need to talk as a family. This has gone entirely too far." My father lifted his hand in a slow, patronizing gesture meant to command silence. "No one is here to upset you, Amber. We just want you to be reasonable." Reasonable. The ultimate family code word for silent submission. Jake rolled his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest. "Can we please stop acting like you almost died?" Eric completely overreacted. The paramedics were clueless, and now Mom's entire 50th birthday is completely ruined forever. Something inside my mind went completely still. It wasn't the frozen, helpless numbness of the past. It was the absolute, unyielding stillness of a judge entering a courtroom, ready to hand down a final, permanent verdict. I stood up from the hospital chair, slowly and deliberately. My body was still exhausted, but I didn't let myself lean back. Eric murmured, "Amber, you don't have to do this," but I just looked at him and softly replied, "I know. That's why I want to." I turned my gaze to Jake first. "You just called my breathing emergency a hospital vacation," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet common area. Jake's eyes immediately darted to the other patients in the room, his face shifting as he realized people were listening. "You said I was dragging it out for sympathy. Yesterday, you told our cousins I always make things about me. When I fainted during finals week at 16, you told everyone I was desperate for attention. My pain has been your favorite family joke for years, Jake. But no one is laughing today." Jake's mouth opened, but for the first time in his life, no sarcastic joke came out. He looked entirely hollowed out by the blunt truth. I turned to my father next, matching his hard stare with absolute, icy calm. "And you? You called me lazy while I was suffocating beside the sink. You told me to toughen up after the ambulance took me away, and then you texted me that I embarrassed Mom and needed to fix it. Not once in the last 24 hours did you ask if your daughter was afraid. You only cared about how the neighbors viewed the flashing lights." David's face hardened into a deep, furious crimson, but his eyes frantically scanned the corridor. He desperately cared about witnesses, and right now, the entire floor was watching his mask slip. Finally, I looked at my mother. She had tears pooling in her eyes, perfectly timed, but I didn't let them rewrite the narrative this time. "And you told me to get in the kitchen and clean. Your hand flew to your chest just now, but where was that hand when I was begging for help? You didn't come to the hospital until hours later because you were finishing your birthday cake. You texted me asking, 'Are you calm now?' like my lungs had thrown a tantrum. You treat my medical crisis like an injury done to you." Sarah's tears spilled over, but nobody moved to comfort her. Not the nurses, not Eric, not even Jake. For the first time in her life, my mother had to stand inside the full, crushing weight of her own cruelty without me rushing to soften the blow. Nurse Marisol stepped forward with a security guard trailing closely behind her. "Amber," she asked clearly, "would you like these people escorted out?" My mother whispered desperately, "Amber, please don't do this to us in public." "You humiliated me in front of 30 people while I was begging for air," I replied, my voice echoing off the wide windows. "This isn't public, this is accountability. You taught me that staying quiet would never save me, so I am finally speaking up." My father growled, pointing a finger at Eric. "You put her up to this." "No," I said, stepping backward, entirely out of their reach. "You did. Every single time you dismissed me. Family is not a lifetime pass to cause me harm. If you ignore my boundary, I will go completely no contact. I am following medical advice to reduce my exposure to conflict, and that means removing myself from your reach." That sentence ended the argument. The security officers stepped in, guiding them firmly toward the exit doors. They had to walk out under the judgmental gaze of strangers. Their power had always depended on absolute privacy, and I had just stripped that away forever. When the doors finally closed, I sat back down, watching the morning sunlight pour through the glass. I didn't feel a wicked sense of revenge. I just felt a deep, beautiful, unfamiliar wave of peace. Over the next few weeks, I moved my things into a small, quiet apartment with vibrant green plants on the windowsill. I left a dish in the sink without hearing my mother's screaming voice in my head. I slept through Sunday dinner for the first time in my life. I wrote 3 permanent rules on a sticky note and placed it firmly on my bathroom mirror. I will not argue with people who need me broken to feel innocent. I will not confuse guilt with love. I will not return to any room where my pain is treated like entertainment. My mother sent one final message from an unknown number a week ago. It read, "I miss my daughter." I stared at the screen for a long time, sipping my coffee, completely unbothered by the old weight of guilt. I typed back a single permanent response, "I miss the mother I needed." Then I blocked that number too. So, let me ask you honestly, as we sit here together, do you think Amber's family was truly sorry for what they did? Or were they just terrified because they finally lost control of the script? And if you were standing in my shoes, would you ever open that door again? Or would you protect the peace you almost lost your breath trying to find? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and type the word boundaries if you are finally ready to protect your own air.